Let's start with the basics. The Noah's Ark Society published a handbook that detailed how to develop physical mediumship abilities. Physical mediumship is an old term that is based on the premise that you can act as a medium through which spirits can physically influence the material world. This is in contrast to mental mediumship, which involves using psychic ability to do things like seeing or hearing spirits. The handbook in question states that they don't know how the development of physical mediumship takes place, nor do they know why it takes place just because a certain number of people regularly sit together. The last part about mediumship developing as a result of people sitting together is essentially a materialistic oversimplification. It views the process solely in terms of physical proximity rather than in terms of creating conditions that transcend simple material arrangement so that paranormal activity is likely to take place. I will explain later why mediumship can be developed in this manner, but I wish to explain the basics first. There is an issue sometimes with the way some people use the term physical mediumship. They may ask for spirits to move objects and get an appropriate movement as a response, but that doesn't mean a spirit was actually responsible. I will elaborate with the experimentation done by Count de Gasperin many years ago. In the practice of table tipping, it is believed that spirits are responsible for moving the table. In reality, the force that moves the table is a composite of all the individuals at the table. Each person has a paranormal influence of their own, yet these forces can be at odds with one another. A person with a strong force overpowers a weaker force. When the forces are at odds with each other in this way, due to a difference of the wills, the overall force becomes weaker because they are no longer working together. When they ask the table to answer a question, the person with the most influence over the table would typically be the one providing the answer that is rapped out. This was a problem because they started out with one of the members who knew the answer, and this meant that a weaker member with the correct answer would be overruled by a stronger member with the wrong answer. It was obvious that change was needed here. 2 and then later 3 members were given the correct answer, which meant they had a combined force that overruled a single person with a stronger force. However, the most powerful member could regularly overrule a coalition of weaker members. It is commonly called telekinesis or psychokinesis when you are paranormally influencing an object. Since telekinesis is derived from living participants, it is obviously not dependent on the whim of spirits. From all the research I have done, it seems clear that physical mediumship is a specific type of telekinesis. Telekinesis, including physical mediumship, is really a group effort. That doesn't mean that you can't do these things by yourself, only that they will be generally less impressive. I will also explain why this is the case later. Continuing with the basic terminology, a circle refers to a group of participants, who are also called sitters. Likewise, a sitting or seance refers to a specific meeting of the circle members. The handbook states that developing any kind of physical mediumship requires a high level of harmony between the sitters at all times. More specifically, a kind of camaraderie and a blending of thoughts are needed to create manifestations. It is worth asking at this point why this kind of unity is necessary. This is the case because manifestation is a group effort that requires enough combined force for strong results to take place. The handbook also explains that you should generally have at least 4 sitters, otherwise you won't have enough combined power or psychic force. Yet if you have more than 11 sitters, you increase the chances of absenteeism and disharmony due to simple human nature. If we continue to the section about seating arrangement, it gives a bit of common sense advice about how you should sit people comfortably close enough so that they could hold hands for short periods without strain or discomfort, but not uncomfortably close. Rather strangely, this book suggests alternating the seating man-woman, under the theory that it balances the power better. In my opinion, there are 2 major things wrong with this idea. The first is the overly simplistic notion of choosing seating positions based on gender rather than psychic force. The second is the unwise presumption that it is somehow preferred to have an even distribution of force rather than choosing to concentrate the psychic force. It would be better to conclude that concentrating the force concentrates its effect and that distributing it has the opposite effect when all other factors remain equal. This sort of concept is not just theory. In the case of group telekinesis projects where beginners are all taught at once, it is the case that surrounding an unsuccessful person with successful people results in the increased chance of success for the person who didn't have it already. I would also suggest that the goal is to concentrate the power as much as possible by sitting the most powerful people next to each other. The sitting arrangement of sittings and table turning telekinesis is generally circular for the reason of practicality and convenience. The idea is to sit participants in descending order of power, radiating outward from the strongest individual, so that the most powerful person sits opposite the least powerful. I want to emphasize that this is not intended to create any kind of arbitrary group hierarchy, and that a hierarchy situation can cause needless division and ego issues. This is purely a practical matter with the goal of concentrating power so that the phenomena is generally stronger and more frequent. Worrying about seating arrangement is not necessary if you have very few people, like the general minimum of 4, because you will already be sitting close to each other. I would like to clarify something too. There is a reason why I'm not suggesting a seating arrangement that places the weak next to the strong with the goal of making the weak stronger. This is because the goal of that group telekinesis project was to teach a lot of beginners at once who could not otherwise have an opportunity to learn it. A circle of people that frequently meet to develop their mediumship abilities is totally different, because having continuous, high-quality sittings or sessions, you have an opportunity and privilege that most people don't. By continually going to these sittings, you have a very high likelihood of successfully developing telekinesis in the context of physical mediumship. When you are starting a circle from scratch and no one in the circle has any significant mediumistic or telekinetic abilities, the seating arrangement matters relatively little. Seating arrangement matters significantly more when the sitters have varying levels of ability. Let's go back to Count de Gasperin's findings regarding telekinesis. He found that the will of the strongest member could overrule the will of weaker members. The general idea was that you would ask the table a question, and there would be a series of telekinetic raps that gave an answer. If the strongest member could successfully override weaker members, the answer in his mind would be the answer rapped out on the table. Alternatively, if the weaker members were unified and collectively stronger than the individually strongest member, their answer would be rapped out. The instructions given by Count de Gasperin was to have a chief or leader of the group command each of the feet of the table to move. If any of the feet refuse the command, then it's likely the case that a person who is next to the leg is the problem. Since the Count had a lot of people who had the ability already, the solution for him was to simply replace the person responsible with someone more capable. So you now understand how to determine who is the strongest member if you wish to know this information. The option to replace a member with someone else is not always available, though. There may only be a few people interested or available to join your circle. Gasperin does not seem to identify what the core problem is with the person in question either. Essentially, he only says that some people are detrimental to the force, regardless of their goodwill and faith in the table. Considering what we now know, it seems likely that these people were not in harmony with the rest of the group and served as an opposing force, detracting from the overall effect. With this knowledge, we can form practical solutions like a harmony-building exercise. I'll talk about this more in depth later. The handbook states that an irate or non-harmonious thought from one member affects everyone. Additional, if a couple of married sitters had a serious argument before the circle meeting, they shouldn't join that session because it would be impossible for them to be completely calm and harmonious with the rest of the group. The handbook also says that you should faithfully stick to a day and time of sitting, always starting on time and excluding latecomers. The implication being that latecomers would be disruptive. Similarly, it is recommended that the sitters should arrive half an hour before the seance is going to start in order for them to settle in and clear their minds of distracting thoughts and stresses. The handbook also says that your circle should sit exclusively for the physical phenomena and that this should be the only type of mediumship that must be developed in the circle. The reason given for this is that the goal should be to have only one physical medium develop in the circle. The assumption here is that there should be a single medium. To me, this assumption defies reason because multiple mediums would create significantly more overall phenomena. This assumption in question is based off of a fundamental misunderstanding. The handbook says that the medium for the circle is chosen by spirits and that it's important for the rest of the sitters that they don't seek personal development of mediumship. This portrays physical mediumship as if it is something that only develops as the result of an external spiritual influence rather than an ability that is the result of refining individual psychic power. Adhering to the flawed notion that a single medium is preferred results in an arbitrary self-limitation when the alternative option is to deliberately proliferate physical mediumship. The handbook goes on to describe the importance of blocking out light in the room that you are going to have the seance in an attempt to describe why total darkness is necessary. A post hoc rationalization is given as the explanation. A post hoc rationalization is a reason or justification given after the fact. It gives the illusion of understanding. Specifically, it is stated that chemicals inside ectoplasm are sensitive to light and that all human life is conceived in the dark and born into the light. This symbolic idea of life being conceived in darkness is used in relation to the concept of ectoplasm being sensitive to light. This is plausible given the fact that people really don't understand what ectoplasm is in the first place, but it certainly doesn't demonstrate causation. Additionally, to suggest that there is a logical connection between conception and ectoplasm is a completely baseless assertion. This book gives an irrational explanation instead of one that uses actual reasoning and evidence. It continues and states that if materializations are strong enough, they can be sustained in red light, with some mediums capable of sustaining them in subdued white light or even rarer natural light. It is also stated that a single pinpoint of light shining into a room can disrupt a seance. We require a better explanation for why darkness might be important. Kenneth Batcheldor came up with a theory that suggestion could be used to achieve telekinesis. More specifically, they adopted a seance-like conditions with darkness and a tube that had luminous paint on it. The members of the group all put a finger on the tube simultaneously and thought at that very moment that the tube would levitate. It seemed to levitate 2 feet up, but it was impossible to avoid thoughts of doubt, so it was difficult to repeat this kind of success. Additionally, Batcheldor points out that the exclusion of every bit of light in a room eliminates any reference point. This can aid the autokinetic effect, which causes the illusion of movement when you stare at an object long enough. This creates what Batcheldor calls an artifact, a mundane event mistaken for a paranormal one. Since both actual paranormal events and artifacts give the mind the suggestion that something paranormal is happening, they can both result in genuine paranormal activity. Batcheldor concludes that the adverse effect of light on phenomena like levitation is probably not due to any physical property of light. Instead, light allows clear observation and consequently invites detrimental factors like analytical thinking and scrutiny. Darkness both reduces the tendency and allows for artifacts to occur. The handbook gives basic advice how to operate a circle, stressing the point that you should choose your sitters carefully. It states that if you have the slightest doubt about any potential sitter, it is better to exclude them from the very beginning, rather than to have them unconsciously spoil the circle, only to be weeded out by spirit at a later date. This is another one of those strange ideas that aren't completely accurate. Going back to Count de Gasperin, you can find out if someone is actively detracting from your combined force if you have already reached the point where you can get telekinetic wraps and table movements. You can use reason and experimentation to determine incompatibility at that point. Yet if you are not at the point where you can get significant paranormal activity, your ability to judge incompatibility relies on subjective judgment. I'm not suggesting that subjective judgment is significantly flawed in this context, but it does not seem to be the optimal technique. I would like to suggest an additional option. Psi wheels are small pieces of aluminum foil or paper balanced on top of a sharp object like a needle or toothpick so that they are very easily turned. The point of the psi wheel is to give someone a tangible, visual confirmation of their ability to use telekinesis on an object. If you are very used to using a psi wheel, it's no great inconvenience to get it to move. I would suggest cupping one hand around the psi wheel and putting your other hand on the shoulder of the potential circle member. If it starts to move faster once your hand touches the shoulder of the potential member, that's a good sign because their force is working in harmony with yours. Additionally, the psi wheel is naturally variable and somewhat chaotic as a direct reflection of the average person's frame of mind. If it stops moving instead of moving faster, that doesn't mean the potential circle member is incompatible. It only means that their force isn't in harmony with yours yet. A person's level of comfort around other people is a good sign of their current state of harmony. Over time, as you get to know people, you will feel more comfortable around them and your harmony will build. Additionally, Lloyd Auerbach mentioned a telepathy study in passing that was comparing the ties between fathers and their children versus mothers and their children. The results were that the parent that that child was closest to had the strongest telepathic connection. This is the kind of relationship that we want to have between the members of the group, a close emotional connection. One thing that I want to stress is the fact that the psi wheel isn't a test, it's a friendly collaboration. The Pygmalion effect essentially describes when a good teacher or leader brings out good results in a student through kindness and the expectation that the student can achieve the goal. Testing someone puts them under pressure, even if it's not much. The goal should be to make the average person suitable to join your circle rather than to find reasons to exclude people. You can always find reasons, however minor, to exclude someone if you follow the handbook's advice. Yes, there will always be some people who are fundamentally incompatible, but this incompatibility does not originate at a fundamental paranormal level. Rather, it is the result of a person finding themselves unable to be in harmony with the rest of the group, essentially due to a difference of opinion, personality, or something similar. Essentially, Buddhist philosophy is correct in that conflict arises from the ego. It also says that you must operate a closed circle, one that does not allow visitors or strangers until specific permission is given by a spirit. This idea is interesting because it gives authority over to spirits rather than keeping it in the hands of the circle members. I don't think this is a particularly good idea though, because allowing strangers or visitors is a big decision because it increases both the chance for disharmony and the scrutiny that generally decreases paranormal phenomena. This is not a decision that should be made lightly, especially when we put it into context that not all responses are from spirits. Some responses are just the products of our subconscious minds, as I've already explained. On a similar note, the handbook states that the spirit insists on having no crossed legs during a circle because it closes the flow of energy between the sitters. Like the idea of ectoplasm being sensitive to light, this doesn't make much sense when you question why it would literally be true. It's possible that it's true only in a psychological sense, that crossed legs could represent the body language of someone who is not open or in harmony with the group. I question if this information really did come from a spirit or if it came from someone's subconscious. Next, I want to talk about table tipping and rapping. As I have already explained, these things can be accomplished through telekinesis, and I doubt whether spirits are actually responsible for these effects. The handbook states that it is their experience that it's often better to start off the circle with the pursuit of table phenomena. This is because it's easier to obtain than more complicated physical manifestations and gets the ball rolling quickly. This raises an obvious and significant question. Why is table tipping and rapping easier to accomplish? Consider this. Knocking and rapping is a simple interaction with an object. There is no great finesse or force required to knock or slightly move a table. When we think of this in purely terms of mechanism, it makes sense. There may be a psychological element as well. The handbook continues and explains that circles that start by pursuing table phenomena go to progress rapidly towards better phenomena. Additionally, using a table and getting rapid results that can be seen creates a positive attitude among the sitters, which aids the growth of phenomena dramatically. So we have a clear goal that we want to accomplish, simple rapping or table tipping, and the knowledge that early success with this leads to long-term success, including more advanced phenomena. This brings me to the major issue here, the recommendation to use a heavy table rather than a light one, with the intent that this will ease the doubt of the sitters that the phenomena is genuine. We know about Kenneth Bacheldor's work and the fact that perceiving mundane things as real paranormal phenomena can lead to actual paranormal phenomena. Therefore, we can conclude that it is far better to use the lightest table you can, because this will result in paranormal phenomena faster than a heavy table would. There are two really important parts here. The first is that before the table starts to move, raps, taps, or strong vibrations can usually be felt coming from the table. This is quite significant because it marks the point at which subtle or chaotic phenomena starts to become stronger and more deliberate. The second is that when the table starts to move, the circle leader or spokesman should address the table firmly, instructing it to straighten up and be controlled. This marks the point at which the phenomena should begin to follow your commands. This is extremely similar to the advice and observations made by Count de Gasperin. He suggested that one of the experimenters was to be made chief and given the ability to give commands. The rest of the members immediately repeat the command upon hearing it. The Count explains that words have no effect on the table, but they collect and concentrate the thoughts of the members. In other words, the psychological effect of suggestion causes the minds of the members to contribute to the same goal at the very same instant. I believe the repetition of the commands by the members ensures a mindset of reflexive obedience and occupies the mind with a response that requires conscious thought, effectively undermining the tendency for doubt. The handbook continues and talks about how you can ask questions of the table and have a yes or no answers based on the number of tilts that are given in response. Additionally, the table can spell out things letter by letter by tilting to indicate a specific letter when you recite the alphabet out loud. The handbook states by doing this, the link with spirit becomes stronger and confidence grows amongst the sitters. The advice is also given that spirit should choose who should be the leader of the group. I don't see a huge problem with this, since the role of leader could be filled by anyone without great consequence. It also says that you should not ask searching or test questions of the table at this stage, as the phenomena is not yet strong enough to withstand such a negative pull, and at best the answers to such questions will be influenced by the medium's mind. The handbook concludes that this is why you should wait for stronger indications of mediumship before you seek to establish tests. The admission that the medium's mind can influence the answers is quite revealing, and it confirms the point that I have been repeatedly making, that the force that does the rapping is not directly controlled by a spirit, but comes from the combined telekinetic ability of the members. If what we commonly consider to be physical mediumship is most easily developed through rapping and table tipping, then it would suggest that telekinesis is a kind of foundation. More specifically, telekinesis is a foundation on which mediumship with spirits or the pursuit of other exceptional paranormal activities can be built on. Additionally, we should give credit where credit is due and acknowledge that derivations of the spiritualist-style seances, table tipping, and rapping are probably the most effective methods we have so far in developing individuals' telekinetic abilities to the point where they are very powerful. Another suggestion is given that you should ask spirit who the medium may be, if it is not already known. Again, this reveals the preconception that there is a singular medium who is responsible for the phenomena in a way that he doesn't consciously know. If we reduce this to the mechanistic level and separate out the preconceptions, the term medium in this context simply describes the person in the group who has the greatest individual influence over the force. The reason why it is difficult to determine who has the greatest individual influence is because they aren't doing any specific tests to see which of them is stronger. Within the context of the handbook, the knowledge of who the medium or strongest member is has somewhat limited effect because the authors of the handbook don't seem to know how to choose seating arrangements based on that information, and they don't seem to be able to leverage that information towards achieving a specific important goal. A medium or strongest member in the earliest stages of development means very little because no extremely significant phenomena has developed yet. Continuing with the topic of trying to communicate with spirits, I want to mention a couple sections of an old book about supposed spirit manifestations. One of these practices was impressional spirit writing, which involves writing down the conscious impressions that came to the awareness of a person, and then they write these impressions down. The authors seek to test the knowledge of the so-called spirit that was supposed to be responsible for these impressions. The conclusion here was that the so-called spirit could only speak the language of the communing person and no others. Additionally, the author went to the house of a writing medium and through experimentation determined that the so-called spirit of this medium was unable to reply to questions in Spanish because the medium neither spoke nor understood the language. The author then essentially concludes that spirits could only produce the languages known by the medium. We can conclude that the so-called spirits that these people were conversing with was nothing more than their own subconscious, which had no paranormal ability to gain knowledge. Therefore, it was limited to the knowledge naturally held within the mind. This is similar to Count de Gasperin's findings that the so-called spirits didn't have knowledge outside of what the person normally knew. Likewise, it's similar also to the findings of the handbook, which mentioned that in the early stages of physical mediumship, certain questions could be influenced by the mind of the medium. What does all of this mean? Simply that in each of these situations, the subconscious of an individual, or the accumulation of subconscious knowledge held by a group of people, is used to give the answers. In his book, Count de Gasperin mentions phenomena that falls into the second category. This was not in the context of his personal experience, but in the testimony of other people too well established to be called into question. Unfortunately, I don't know who the Count is referring to yet. I will have to do more research to determine that. Setting that tangent aside, we can observe that there seems to be an inherent degree of error that comes with any information derived from the subconscious, and an inherent limit on the knowledge available, at least in the early stages. We already know through the practice of remote viewing that people can be taught a refined, controlled version of clairvoyance and use it to gather highly accurate and detailed information. This is possible if they gain enough skill and also train on targets that can be verified. After all, if you can't verify the information you are obtaining, your ability to improve your accuracy is somewhat limited. It may be the case that within the context of physical mediumship, the combined force that gives the answers has to be first refined for basic accuracy only in relation to the knowledge that is already known to the people in question. I'm suggesting that gaining the ability to create rapping and table tipping effects is different than the ability to paranormally gain knowledge. Therefore, we should have no reason for expecting highly accurate knowledge to be immediately paranormally available as soon as we obtain basic telekinesis. Additionally, we should only expect a high level of accuracy if the same group of people have trained their combined paranormal force over a significant period of time on questions that were verified. On that note, the handbook suggests to record the events of the sittings, and I believe that this is a great idea. I would emphasize that during sittings you avoid skeptical thoughts, but wait until the review of the recording to be skeptical. I say this because skeptical thoughts tend to reduce the amount of paranormal phenomena that occur. The handbook also says that it's important to begin a sitting with a prayer, yet it specifically says that this action has no connection whatsoever to do with religion. It also states that it's a fact that prayer is a very powerful tool in making contact with the spirit world and in asking for cooperation in your efforts to produce physical phenomena. It is worth asking why this would be the case if this is actually true. I believe that this is similar to what Count de Gasperin said about how commands don't affect the table, but they affect the people around the table. It is likely that openly praying, as the handbook suggests, has a psychological effect that allows for better success. It also says that it's vital that you ask for protection from unwelcome spirit entities of a lower order, which is generally a good idea. It continues and states that the theme of the opening prayer should be complementary to the aims of the circle, concentrating only on the circle, its hopes, aspirations, and spirit helpers. Additionally, it says that you shouldn't include thoughts for help and healing for the whole world, as this essentially detracts from your energy and hinders results. This confirms my hypothesis that the prayer in question serves as a psychological focal point that guides the members of the circle. Since the prayer guides your own power and your power is limited, you want to avoid squandering your power on things that aren't immediately important. Additionally, it says that public prayer has a tendency to become a set formula that lacks sincerity, which is a bad thing. The solution to this is a round-robin prayer in which a sitter starts the spontaneous prayer with 2 or 3 sentences, and then traveling in a clockwise direction, each sitter adds a couple of sentences until the last sitter completes their part and finishes with an amen. This, of course, is a very clever idea that serves to join each of the sitters together in mental harmony. The handbook says that immediately after the opening prayer, there should be music in the circle, singing in unison, alternated with taped music. The music should vary between soothing and restful music, which harmonizes the emotions of the sitters, and lively, rousing, sing-along music, which rapidly raises the power level in the circle. This power can be felt in the atmosphere, and it's important that it's maintained throughout the whole setting. Because of this, the music or singing should occur at frequent intervals. It also says that spirit needs the sound of human voices to help with development. This leads me to believe that the term spirit in this context refers to a personification of the combined paranormal force. The idea that an actual spirit needs the sound of a human voice to achieve a goal is very unlikely when we consider that people who have had near-death experiences talk of telepathic communication with spiritual beings rather than verbal speech as we know it. It would be more appropriate to think of spirits as seeing telepathic communication as the default. The handbook again emphasizes that the goal is to bring harmonious atmosphere because harmony among the sitters is the one condition that brings speedy results. I would also add that it helps to have a fun, joking mentality when no one thinks too much about themselves in a serious way. This helps to break down the mental barriers that people normally have. It suggests that you should almost have a party atmosphere, which makes me think of another important parallel. You don't need to be in the presence of a medium or in a sitting to develop telekinesis. Jack Houck was a pioneer of the concept of psychokinesis parties. He did this because the combination of an excited party atmosphere and the accumulative paranormal influence of many people gave most of the people who participated the ability to use telekinesis. Specifically, the ability to bend metal spoons through intent, which is definitely a significant feat. Similarly, the reason most people became physical mediums in the sense that they gain significant paranormal influence is because they have been put under the right conditions that allowed this ability to develop. Now that I've mentioned music and darkness separately, I want to mention how these two things affect the sitters. The two major psychological barriers that we must overcome are witness inhibition and ownership resistance. Both witnessing a paranormal effect and acknowledging that you were the cause of the effect are very shocking and potentially distressing things. Therefore, people are resistant to taking ownership of paranormal effects, and they are similarly resistant to clear observation of these effects in the first place. Singing, shouting, and laughter prevents you from thinking too critically and can relegate paranormal effects to the background of your attention at the critical moment. It serves as a distraction, while complete darkness prevents you from clearly observing the effect in the first place. Clear observation of the phenomena is unsettling enough that it tends to disrupt the telekinetic process and prevent repetition. These two things, darkness and singing, overcome the witness inhibition part. Similarly, the idea that spirits are directly responsible for the effects serves to deflect from the issues of ownership resistance. Additionally, gradual desensitization to paranormal phenomena over the course of many sittings is the long-term solution to undermining these two psychological barriers. This is what allows for strong phenomena to be clearly observed even in natural light. Also, many people do not have the opportunity to join a sitter group. We can still use the knowledge of many of these principles at the individual level, though. Finding the optimal way to apply these principles at the individual level is something that really requires more research and deep thought on my part, though. Consider this. The reason why telekinesis is generally more productive in groups is because people have a small amount of individual paranormal influence because of psychological barriers. When you have a lot of people, this small influence can add up and achieve significant results. In comparison, when you're just by yourself, your influence can affect something smaller like a psi wheel. Additionally, it seems to be the case that the reason why a psi wheel is harder to influence when protected by a glass jar or something similar is because of witness inhibition. When a jar covers the psi wheel, you're effectively preventing your mind from accepting mundane explanations for the movement of the wheel. Therefore, it's not only clear observation of the paranormal that you are trying to achieve, it's also an attempt to witness something that part of your mind doesn't want to accept. These psychological barriers to significant telekinesis are tied to the ego, because we only feel upset about things in relation to the ego. There are some Buddhists, as an example, who meditate a lot and have reduced their ego and are able to use telekinesis to some degree as a result. However, I would say that meditation seems to be an inefficient way of trying to accomplish telekinesis. It seems to be more efficient to directly pursue desensitization because trying to eliminate your ego is not only a really difficult thing to do, it's also an indirect way of achieving the goal. As a side note, Buddhism exists as a paradigm with its own assertions and assumptions. One of these assumptions is that you should pursue the Buddhist understanding of enlightenment. It's a worldview built off of a limited understanding and should be treated as such. There is no empirical evidence that anyone has ever achieved enlightenment, and no evidence that such a state is actually possible. It's important to understand the two states of mind as they relate to telekinesis. The first is the divided state, which is the normal state of mind where your subconscious and conscious is divided. The conscious can't directly influence the subconscious in this state, but it can do so indirectly by issuing firmly believed in suggestion. Think about it like this. When the sitters hear the command for the table to move, the reason that the table moves is because they thoroughly believe it can. I could also put this in a more counterintuitive way that will change your perspective. The chair that you are sitting in right now could potentially obey your command to move if you believe strong enough that it would actually happen. Yet this method of indirect control of telekinesis is not consistently successful. The second state of mind is when the conscious partially blends with the subconscious. The blended state is like the Zen state. Additionally, we know from special experiments where sitters attempted to make their minds blank and observe in a passive manner that they achieved direct control over their target's movement by thought alone. This was very difficult to achieve, however. As explained before, it is common for sitter groups to expect paranormal activity to give responses to questions. John Hasted was working with people who have telekinetic abilities, but these people didn't learn telekinesis from a sitter group context, so when he tried asking questions with the goal of getting a response on strain gauges, he had no success. Those who learn telekinesis outside of a sitter group context simply don't have that question and answer type of psychological trigger for telekinesis. Many people with different perspectives and experiences with telekinesis have come to the same conclusion that if you adopt a passive, non-striving, or inattentive mindset, the state of mind will allow you to better perform telekinesis. There are many ways to describe this feeling, but perhaps the best way is that when you are staring blankly at something and you sort of just relax your mind to the point where you don't have any thoughts anymore. John Hasted says that it appears that the strongest telekinetic effects often take place when the subject relaxes directly after concentration. The idea that reality as we know it can be changed when you alter your mindset to the point where you have no thoughts, only being, is very much in line with Buddhist philosophy. There is also a kind of transmissibility element to some paranormal phenomena. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, is when you ask questions out loud and use an electronic recording device to capture an answer from a spirit. As the handbook describes, this form of physical mediumship can be caught like a common cold. The author states that when he conducted an EVP workshop throughout the week, all of those who attended started getting voices within a week. This kind of ability is easy to develop at home, and you don't need a circle for it. The obvious question is why? Why is this ability easily transmissible, and why does it not require the combined effort of a circle to achieve? Let's address the transmissibility point first. The psychic Uri Geller is well known for his ability to telekinetically bend metal spoons. Some of the people who are home watching the broadcast of Uri doing this also noticed metal bending as well. So at first glance, it would appear that Uri was having some kind of distant effect on spoons. However, it seemed to be the case that the same thing would happen during videotape replays. This leads us to the conclusion that Uri was acting as a psychological catalyst that activated latent telekinetic ability in other people. So telekinesis seems to have a transmissibility effect like EVPs do, and it could very well be the case that they both operate on the same principle of a psychological trigger. That would explain why it's transmissible, but perhaps doesn't fully explain why EVP phenomena in particular is so easily transmissible. I want to briefly mention the hitchhiker effect in relation to this topic. The hitchhiker effect refers to when someone encounters paranormal activity and that paranormal activity seems to follow them from the original location. I would suggest that at least in some of these cases, the original paranormal encounter was a psychological trigger that allowed their own paranormal power to continue to cause these events to happen. So each of these phenomena could follow a simple pattern of exposure to something paranormal, a psychological trigger is flipped, and then phenomena continues to be recreated through the individual's paranormal power. Additionally, the physicist John Hasted mentions that in the presence of a strong metal bender, the power is sometimes transferred to other people to temporarily gain the ability to bend metal themselves. He also says that usually the audience members who gain this ability can't repeat this action on their own. In a circumstance like this, it's hard to determine to what degree the strong metal bender is directly causing the effect, and to what degree the person's own abilities are contributing to the effect. There is also a book written in the early years of the spiritualist movement that I would like to mention. The author starts out thoroughly skeptical and desires to prove mediumship is nothing more than trickery. He proceeds to investigate into the mediumship abilities of the daughter of a Mr. S. In his investigation, he asked mentally, not out loud, various questions to test this daughter. They were all correctly answered. One of the questions that he asked was if there were mediums in his own family, and he received the answer that he was one. He then explains that not long after his return home, he found himself visited by a similar influence. This refers to a force that replies with raps when asked questions. Soon afterwards, his entire family also developed various abilities as well. It appears to be the case that the stronger the phenomena is, the more likely it will be transmitted to other people. This theory fits well with the previously mentioned example of strong metal benders causing audience members to temporarily gain an ability. So I will suggest that the temporary transmissions of ability reflect a temporary suspension of disbelief, while permanent transmissions reflect a more significant and lasting undermining of disbelief at the subconscious level. Circling back to EVPs again, since they can be achieved relatively quickly within a week, but not immediately, this suggests that people are probably lowering their psychological barriers to the phenomena within the span of a week. I say this because if everyone got EVPs all the time on all kinds of ordinary recordings, this would show that spirits can create EVPs easily independently from living humans. Since this isn't the case, then it seems that there is something on our side of the equation that is what changes and allows them to speak. It would follow then that EVPs can be achieved fairly quickly because there is no ownership resistance, because the belief is that there is something other than you that is responsible for the voice. Likewise, there is no witness inhibition because EVP voices can be faint and almost indistinguishable from static. They are far more acceptable and less shocking to the average person than the paranormal movement of large objects. Then it would seem that EVPs are more quickly obtained because of our psychological resistance to them is far lower than the paranormal movement of large objects. I've covered much of the important points of this handbook now, except for certain things about the nature of ectoplasm and mediumistic trances. I didn't cover these topics because my research has been primarily related to telekinesis. I think it's best if I wait until I fully understand a topic before I talk about it. In conclusion, it is my opinion that the most important thing to achieving stronger telekinesis is desensitization. I think it is wrong to view telekinesis as a muscle that gets stronger as it is flexed. This perspective is reinforced by so-called poltergeist cases, where an individual can exert considerable force without understanding how they could be responsible for that kind of phenomena. Continually eroding psychological limitations should give us the ability to do truly impressive things.